Hey, y'all. Okay, and since I have the microphone, I'm going to take just a second and thank Andrew. I'm going to tell you a little story. So, my first trip to the Hill, this is one area that since I'd worked for state government, hadn't done a lot of work in this area. And Bob Dumig and Andrew and I were going on Hill visits. And Andrew asked, just trying to get a feel for what I know, he asked me, so tell me what you know about the political process. And I said, Andrew, everything I know about the political process I learned from Schoolhouse Rock. And he thought I was joking, but he learned that I wasn't. But he has been so patient with me, as has Bob and Scott, and they're such great teachers. And this work is really cool because it's not really something I've done before, so that's cool. Um, but the whole process is just very interesting, very interesting. So thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it. And it is my delight and honor. So, um, Alan Smart, who some of you guys know, um, is with Philanthropy Works, and NoSor is doing some work around foundations and kind of trying to figure out how foundations might work and philanthropy might work with us, and how we might work with philanthropy to work with our communities, those sorts of things. But Alan Smart and I go way back. So if you want to know about his bio, it's in the app. But let me tell you about Alan Smart. He's a he's just a great guy. Um, Nobody knows philanthropy better than he does. And when I started at the state office of rural health in North Carolina, Alan worked for the Catherine B. Reynolds Foundation in Winston-Salem. And part of my job was to go with our rural health clinics to talk to Kate B. Reynolds to see if they couldn't find some money. Again, I was green, didn't know anything about it. And Alan really, he was just super nice, but B, he really broke down the process. Okay, so he dumbed it down so people like me could understand it. So I really appreciated that. Alan, I can't tell you, how great it is to be able to work with you again after all this time, like 2 years, right? Because we're both really young. Um, but I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate everything you're doing to help us. And I look forward to hearing what you have to talk about. Come on up here.
Thanks, Tammy, and greetings from North Carolina, and greetings to the virtual audience. We sometimes forget those folks out there, but appreciate you being on. Been great to be with you last couple of days, and it's been great to meet some of the people I'd only seen on video. So that's been fun. Um, and I'm going to take you through a bit of a dizzying tour through both what I've been doing for NoSor and with some of the state offices, and then just try to give you a grounding in what the world of rural private philanthropy looks like, along with some possibilities for connections that you might make. So we're moving from what was a discussion about an entirely public sector to one that is sometimes or too often entirely private, muddy, translucent versus transparent, and one that is burdened by jargon and everything else that goes along with that. So try to do our best to demystify some of this. So a little bit about what I'm doing for NoSor. So I have completed interviews with 15 state directors from all three sectors, the state-based, the university-based, and the freestanding nonprofits. If anyone wants to kind of join in and go through a short list of questions about your experience with philanthropy, the kinds of opportunities you'd like to have, the kind of infrastructure you'd want to build, I'm happy to interview a few more. Been working to get NoSor just on the radar of some of the funder groups and make a lot of progress there. So there's 2 snapshot guides that will be available to you in the next 30 days or so. One is just a very quick guide to philanthropic resources that if you're not kind of an insider to philanthropy, you might not be aware of. And the other is just some very, very basic steps to starting kind of the rural philanthropic journey, the kinds of questions you might ask, the kind of preparedness you might have. And for some folks, this will be entirely new. For some, it will be a bit of a refresher, but I think it'll be quite useful. There'll be case studies in some of the interviews. People were very explicit that they weren't going to learn particularly well from any kind of theory-bound guide, but needed some case studies, examples from other states. We're doing that. I tested some of the findings I've tied together from the state director interviews with a small group of states Tuesday afternoon here, and some of the recommendations that people were providing. And so that'll come to life probably by January. You'll see those. And then I'm putting together something that will get into your kind of proficiency self-assessments and what those look like if you're really talking about a private philanthropic landscape rather than a governmental private landscape. So all that to be done over the next 2 or 3 months. So excited. And as I said, I'm always available to talk to people offline. I've gotten a number of the state offices connected with funders or funder groups in the last 6 weeks or so, and just happened twice in the last day here. Both Alabama with a new national group of funders focused on rural youth and their opportunities, and then Montana with a national group of funders interested in rural mental health. So happy to do that for anyone else who wants to just check in. So a little bit about me. So as Tammy said, yeah, I spent a number of years as a grant maker in North Carolina, prior to that in rural Louisiana. But prior to that, it actually been in Catholic healthcare that had a lot of rural hospitals, rural components to it, primarily in northern Indiana. So been deeply steeped in the rural health space for a number of years. But about 5 years ago, left my funder role to take on a national project for Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which took me all around the country, sometimes 2 or 3 times around, to really take a look at what funders were doing in the rural space, not just in health, but kind of health broadly defined, and developed a number of case studies and blogs and journal articles coming out of that. But since then have really been the leader of this movement, which had been kind of simmering probably for a couple decades, of how funders need to do more and better by rural places. And I think in some people's minds, that equation is a little more complicated than it needs to be, that all that needs to happen is more money needs to go into rural from private sources. I would say much of the private money from foundations going into rural areas now is poorly executed, may not be working with the right people, not culturally competent. So I'm always saying more and better. And now I work with a whole host of people around the country on these and related issues. So what are we talking about when we're talking about the landscape of who are funders in rural? So even in the poorest rural places, there are family foundations, family funders, sometimes invisible to the public, which have been operating sometimes for many, many decades. So local family and corporate funders. There are now almost 400 health conversion foundations in almost every state. Some very large. These were the conversion of either nonprofit hospitals purchased by for-profits, or the merging of nonprofits with other nonprofits, or state health plans that were nonprofit and went for-profit or were bought in some. And you know, a group of attorney generals came together and said that a foundation had to be formed since all the dollars were created in a tax-free environment. Of course, always local, state, and governmental sources. Local banks in many places are still a source of grant making, not so much from their dollars, but as the trust accounts of people of means in the community. corporate funders with local presence, often untapped, but all having some interest in providing charitable giving in the communities where they might have a branch plant or kind of a manufacturing presence, even though the headquarters may be in Chicago or Los Angeles or Philadelphia. And then individual donors, which we often forget about. There's more individual donor money than all these other sources combined. And the opportunities to tap into that are kind of a long journey, but still there's opportunities to do that. So what's happened in the last 10 years or so, when you think about rural philanthropy and what the changes have been, and I mentioned yesterday, the funders that were about healthcare, primarily healthcare access, have really greatly expanded their issue areas to kind of a social determinants frame, or at least recognizing kind of the intersection of health and other sectors in rural places. As I say, the health of the community from a philanthropic perspective is no longer the province of doctors or the health department or people who have titles or are tasked with that. The sense from a lot of the rural funder community is that the health of the community needs much broader ownership. So a lot of funders working on that. And then, as I just talked about, the emergence of these healthcare conversion foundations, which we're about at the end of wave 3. All of them were stimulated by different forces in the healthcare economy. Need for capitalization regarding technology, fear of being left out of a sole source payment system, and on from there. So what's different about rural grant seeking from urban? And I would posit that one of the primary differences is the difference between relational and transactional approaches. In philanthropy, we talk about transactional funders who really are essentially responding to applications. They are distanced in many ways, formulaic. You may have a difficult time communicating with them or finding some point of common interest or interaction. So the difference for the funders who are really committing or recommitting to rural America is a process or a mindset or a lens that's very relationally based. So simple. Difference between governmental and private philanthropy. You're all involved in governmental philanthropy in some way. Various scoring methods, grids, points. Most rural private philanthropy, if they were in that space, they have moved away from that. And many were never in that space. So it's a very, very different kind of mindset and approach that I'm working with NOSOR on, and what would it look like to kind of have a skills building or kind of teachable curriculum around kind of the differences between the governmental side and the private philanthropy side. And I know many of you, most of you perhaps, sitting in this room or on the call, maybe your first thought would be, we are in state government. How does this apply? Funders wouldn't want to talk to us. We wouldn't know where to start. But I would say with a high level of confidence, funders who are really committed to rural are really interested in working with state government. And that's relatively new, last 5 or 10 years, but was really that kind of mindset was really accelerated during the pandemic, when there was a lot of active conversation between private funders in states and all sorts of various agencies within the state, not just public health, but any folks who were involved in kind of the health of rural communities in the broadest sense. So your state may not be prepared, or your office may not be prepared to do it. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But from the funder side, are funders interested in working with state agencies? And the answer is absolutely yes. maybe not as a direct grantee, but certainly in a pretty close partnership. And as I said, that has changed over the last 10 or 15 years. For all sorts of reasons. Some really to do with kind of the passing down of money between generations and some of these family foundations, and just the opportunity to look at things in a different light. So what are some of the things you're going to face if you're talking to funders who don't have a deep experience or deep commitment, or who may even have bias against doing a lot of work in rural? These are, I could develop a list of 20 of these, but these are probably the top 3 that you would hear back from funders. Essentially, rural America is all white, and you can go to the largest, most well-known names in health funding on a national scale, and they have fairly high-level folks who believe this. Data be damned. They have never left the Boston, New York, DC corridor. And for whatever reason, they are unable to digest the fact that most rural places have a dynamic population. They're booming immigrant communities in 30 states. We see coming out 2020 census, which did a relatively poor job at counting anyway, but just what was counted showed tremendous transitions in a lot of communities. But that's a widely held opinion. Things are static. Innovation is not happening. Why would we want to be working in rural? There's just not that kind of energy that we see in urban places. And then the last, we can't be in every town of 500 people. We just don't have. We're never going to move the needle, as the funders love to say. Being in these little towns or these rural counties. And these are widely held kind of mythology of philanthropy about rural. These are 3 of the most widely held tenets of the mythology. So just the shorthand responses. I just mentioned it. Shifting demographics, whether it be in specific counties within your state or regions. You have data that can show any funder that things are moving, that populations are not static. I think the second is just identifying, what are just innovative responses with limited resources that people in rural communities are, have cobbled together in some cases to really address some critical issues, and what can be learned from those examples. And as Tom Morris has often said, we need to start looking at some of these rural successes, actually adapting them for urban, and not just always thinking that it needs to be that the work in rural needs to be downsized or work from urban to rural. And if there's anything that funders would like to say they want to do, it's to learn, it's to adapt. You cannot adapt work in real time working in an urban or suburban community with 25,000 people engaged over a 5-year span and wait for the evaluations to come out every 3 or 4 years. All the learning essentially has been lost. Your ability to actually learn more and adapt. Rural funders are increasingly finding what a perfect place, because we can adapt in real time. We don't have to go the course for a 3-year grant, which we know is losing energy or failing. We can make some midterm corrections, and you just can't do that in traditional urban grant making. So one thing you'll hear about from funders who are committed to this work is the need to work with what we are calling rural anchor institutions. So institutions or sectors that are present in just about every rural place. Everyone has a library, ag extension, the county manager, the school district. So no matter what the issue, whether it's an education issue, transportation, economic development, on and on, name your issue, opioids, there is some sense from rural funders that you should be working with those institutions in a way that's meaningful, that has a long-term mindset, um, and so that your grant seeking or your interest in building a relationship with a funder is not just on your behalf, but is on behalf of these larger institutions in a rural place, and more of the same. There are a number of funders who are really interested right now in rural community colleges as being this bridge or broker or facilitator for a lot of their work. And so it's kind of an exciting development. And so what comes of that long term, I'm not sure. Some places clearly have a really strong rural community college system, others less so. But just to let you know, this community college partnership model is really of interest to funders right now. So brief list, what are some hot topics for rural interested funders? I teased, I think 3 yesterday when I was on the panel. Some of these will be just old hat to you. Some will hopefully be a little surprising. And these are not in rank order, so take it that way. Rural mental health, another kind of unintentional benefit of the pandemic, was kind of the exposure of the fragility of rural mental health systems. And so there are a number of new funders who are interested in this. There's actually this national collective of funders that's going to meet in Montana with 25 Montana funders and other stakeholders around rural mental health issues. That is absolutely not something they would have done 3 or 4 years ago. Rural was not on their radar. The pandemic just exposed them to a whole different set of issues. Healthcare workforce, I think we're all aware of that. Urban-rural relationships, the ability to articulate the relationship between a rural county or a rural region and the hub city, or when I lived in rural Louisiana, we used to call Alexandria, the service center, surrounded by 6 or 8 rural parishes. But the ability to articulate what those relationships are as people work in the city, go back home, as goods are moving from rural to urban, really important to funders right now. Another kind of lens that they just wouldn't have had a couple of years ago. Cross-sectoral work, that's kind of how we phrase this idea that health impacts education, impacts economic development, impacts transportation, infrastructure, and all that funders who have formerly been single issue funders are now increasingly understanding and committing to this idea of working across sectors. Rural communities of color, another kind of issue that got really highlighted during the pandemic, and funders were often caught off guard. Broadband, we heard about broadband in the public sector. I mentioned yesterday, just for maybe a few of you weren't here. Most funders who are interested in rural have been standing aside on broadband because they thought it required tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, and very few private foundations have that amount of money. Now they're seeing their ways, almost out of necessity, funders want to be engaged around broadband. Affordable housing, I mentioned that yesterday. Maternal mortality has got a lot of, has been highlighted or elevated in the last year or two. And then working with federal government offices. So just briefly, and this is part of the guide that you'll see coming out next 30 or 45 days, how to begin to develop relationships with funders, invite them to stuff you're doing. It actually happens much more rarely than you think. So many funders now are spending so much time, energy, and resources on doing white papers, pushing out communications about different issues. Call them up or comment on the work you're seeing and how it relates to your work. in 20 years as an active funder, I think probably less than half a dozen times did anyone ever reach out to us about something we had produced or put out and said, oh, we're interested in that. Here's how it connects to our work. And those people immediately got a gold star, and we paid attention to them. And meet them where they are. Funders are often holding public events that you can attend, well marketed in their websites and their listservs. I'll skip through that one. I know we're down at the end here. And a list of resources that'll also be in the guide that I mentioned previously on preparing for NoSOAR that you'll all have access to. And that's it from my side. So thank you, and good luck to you all. As I said, I'd really encourage you, if you have questions or you just want to shoot the breeze about some philanthropic engagement you tried and it didn't work out as well, or something you've heard about, or you just need a network or a resource, that's kind of what I'm here for the short term at least. So thank you. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I have just a quick question. How do you go about finding sort of local sources of funding? We all know about the Robert Wood Johnsons and the big ones, but there's also smaller local community ones. And how do you go about finding who's available in your community that might be willing to do funding?
Yeah, the question was, how do you find out about, local funders who don't have a big brand name, that, don't have, aren't visible in the same way that a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation might be. That'll also be part of this guide series, but really two ways. One would be through just about every state has a state grant makers association. You can go on the website and you'll see all their members, and you'll recognize funders who are working in your communities who you may have never heard of. And the second would be, there are two standard kind of databases. One is free, one is GuideStar. The second has the subscription, different levels of subscription, depending on how deep you want to get into it. The foundation directory online, and they don't do a great job of sourcing by rural. They do a great job at sourcing by geography, and you have to put what is rural together with the geography to make it make sense.
So this might be more maybe even for Tammy, but so with the partnership then that we have with you, is it going to be up to each of us SOARs to kind of work through this guide and reach out, or is NorSOAR going to do that more at a national level and then disseminate information down to us and say, hey, look at these funders and so forth, or how's that partnership going to work?
Yeah, I think that is more for Tammy. I think that will be part of some of my recommendations for what role NoSOAR can play. And there are some in terms of hosting resources. There's some in terms of facilitating these conversations with funders. But Tammy may have a different plan.
And at this point we're still kind of gathering information, and then we'll start putting a plan together. And the thing is, we need y'all help us help you, right? To quote Jerry Maguire. We'll need y'all to help us figure that out. And it might work one way in your state and another in North Carolina or whatever. So we want to be able to have some flexibility and meet folks where they are, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question? Sorry, I felt like I talked all the way around it. Okay.
Online, Matt? Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Alan.
Okay, thank you.